Gonna pass it to Greg from Councilmember Shekar Krishnan's office.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see everyone here and excited to be on this webinar with you all. I'm the Legislative and Budget Director for Councilmember Shekar Krishnan, who represents Woodside, Jackson Heights, and Elmhurst here in the Great Borough of Queens. Happy to be here, and I'll be chatting with you guys in a little bit about some exciting updates. Also, he, him, I use he, him, his pronouns.
Thank you so much, Greg. And if you have any questions throughout this entire presentation, please add them to the chat. You can DM Jimin or Lloyd or even Greg during his portion, but we'd appreciate if you just put it in the chat so everyone can see your question. And then you can also come off mute if you do have a question throughout the presentation. There's also time at the end to ask any questions that you might have. You'll notice that I just pressed record also on this presentation so that folks who were unable to join us can look back and watch. So hopefully that's okay. We're going to move forward. So our agenda encompasses so many different parts to lead us to where we're going. We definitely want to review what we've been defining as data disaggregation and provide some examples of what that will look like. We're going to share more about our 2016 demographic data law, where we passed in 2016 and have been monitoring the implementation and what we found from that work. And we've been doing that in conjunction with Councilmember Krishnan's office, as well as Councilmember Lincoln Ressler's office. And then we're going to share more about the revision bill, why we're revising this bill that we championed in 2016. Why are these revisions so meaningful to how our communities are seen and heard here in New York City? And then Greg is going to share more about that legislative process. What are the pieces that we need to, what are the steps that we need to take in advocacy in order to get something like this passed in City Council? And then, of course, what's ahead and what we'll need you to do and show up as a community going forward. Any questions about the agenda, thoughts before we move? All right, if there aren't any questions, feel free to ask later. I'm going to move, kick this over to Jimin, who's going to share more about who we are in terms of Invisible No More campaign.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Felicia, for the introduction. So before we actually start with our webinar, I wanted everyone, if they have a chance, to turn on their camera so we could take a group photo so we could post it on our social media. So I ask everyone to just turn on your cameras just for a few minutes so we could take a picture with everyone here. That'll be great. So Lakshmi, just let me know once you're ready. Okay, 1, 2, 3, smile, everyone. We're good?
Yes.
All right, we're good, everyone. So thank you, everyone, for turning their cameras on for a few seconds. And we are going to officially start about who we are as an Invisible No More campaign. Felicia? Next slide. So a little bit about Invisible No More campaign. We have been fighting for a decade to ensure that our New York City and state governments collect accurate data and information, specifically disaggregated data on our diverse Asian American Pacific Islander communities. Our mission is to advocate for API data disaggregation in New York City and New York State. And our vision ultimately is for our community members, our advocates, our community-based organizations, and most importantly, our legislators to use these data to develop policy solutions to address the needs of marginalized API communities. And our Invisible No More campaign has been working very hard. And I'm going to be showing a timeline as to what are some of the exciting things that our campaign has been working for the past decade. And I'm really excited to share some of the more exciting news of how we're going to move forward. Next slide, Felicia.
There might be a lag, but I'm on the task force. There you go. You see it?
Yeah, we see it. Thank you, Felicia. Sorry for the lag, everyone. So the Invisible No More campaign, we recently revamped it and reorganized our Invisible No More campaign in a way how can we make sure that we have data disaggregation for all our communities? So obviously there are three pillars to the Invisible No More campaign. First is CACF, and we play the bridge between community and government stakeholders and making sure that we have disaggregated data on our communities and focus on the advocacy for API children and families. And we also have our task force, and a lot of our participants today who joined us in this virtual convening are part of our I&M task force. There are 18 API serving organizations representing 20 and more API communities in New York City, and provide mostly services to vulnerable communities who are oftentimes low income or recently arrived immigrants. And they play a pivotal role in letting us CACF know what are some of the data that is missing on our communities and making sure that our data disaggregation or data equity laws that we are trying to hope to pass this year will mean to their communities and how that's going to look like. And we obviously have our I&M partners. We have Hispanic Federation, New York Immigration Coalition, and the MENA NY Coalition. Specifically, I want to give a shout out to Taina, who's in this call today. It has been a terrific moment for us to work with New York Immigration Coalition in our fight for data disaggregation. So just wanted to give a shout out. And these are the three pillars that make the Invisible No More campaign and make sure that we are able to have meaningful data disaggregation policies and disaggregate data on our communities. Next slide, please. So I know we've had some past webinars on data disaggregation, and some of you might have joined us before. I just wanted to do a quick poll to see what are some of our understanding about what is data disaggregation. So if everyone could have a chance to answer the poll that's been launched, it's how many folks are familiar with data disaggregation? So we have a lot of yeses, somewhat. All right. It seems like most of us here who are joining us today is very familiar or somewhat familiar with data disaggregation. And I'm very happy to see no answers, because that means that we're doing our jobs, right? So I'm really excited that we are all a little bit familiar with data disaggregation, but just to go over the overview of what it is. Disaggregation itself just means breaking down the large data categories into more specific subcategories. So for example, we could talk about race, such as white, Asian, Black, Latinx, but those are some aggregate data that represents a large subset of communities. But when we specifically want to talk about specific subcategories, we're talking about Korean, Bangladeshi, we're talking about other African diaspora communities. And we wanted to be as specific as possible because every community is unique and they have specific challenges that we are not able to see if we don't have disaggregated data. So data disaggregation. So it refers to the collection, reporting, and analysis of the information on specific subgroups by race, ethnicity, and other characteristics. And why data disaggregation is so important is because researchers and policymakers are able to better analyze differences between groups, as well as the relationships between multiple variables such as race and age. And I'm going to show an example as to how data disaggregation could be used as a means for policy change and for the improvement for our communities. Next slide, please. So there is a use case of how data disaggregation is being used in our public policy spaces. So the problem here was that Santa Clara County in California collected disaggregated data on COVID-19 rates and found that Vietnamese and Filipino residents were being hit harder than any other Asian American groups. And what are the policy response because we have disaggregated data? They are able to conduct targeted in-language outreach and education in areas that have predominantly Vietnamese communities. And soon after, they were able to see the positivity rates of COVID rates leveled out for this group. So data disaggregation makes sure that our communities are being seen in the government data collection and processes. I'm going to pause. Does anyone have any questions about data disaggregation itself? All right, we're going to move on. Alicia, next slide, please. So I wanted to give a timeline as to what the Invisible No More campaign has been working on for the past decade. So our Invisible No More campaign has been launched in 2011, and we worked with then Assemblymember Grace Meng, now Congresswoman Grace Meng, to introduce the first API data disaggregation bill in New York State. And subsequent legislators have introduced similar bills in 2019, such as then Assemblymember Yuli Niao and Senator Julia Salazar, and they were able to pass the ANHPI data disaggregation law in both the Assembly and Senate, but then it was vetoed by then Governor Cuomo, and then we had to go back to the process to make sure that we have funding attached to this bill to make sure that agencies are able to actually disaggregate data and have enough money to do so. So we were able to have that negotiation and be able to pass this historic ANHPI data disaggregation law at the end of 2021. But in between those years, we didn't just focus on the state, we also focused on city level advocacy. In 2016, the Invisible No More campaign and other community leaders advocated successfully for the New York City's first ever data disaggregation laws, also better known as demographic data laws, local laws 126, 127, and 128. Next slide, please, Felicia.
Sorry for the lag. It's there. You'll see it in a second.
No worries.
Do you see the change?
Yes, and
Okay,
in recent years, starting in 2022, we really focused on the implementation status of our ANHPI data disaggregation law, and we continue our implementation advocacy throughout those years to make sure that all state agencies are producing disaggregated data on our communities. But most recently in 2024, we decided to revisit the 2016 demographic data laws by revamping our Invisible No More campaign to focus on city level data disaggregation advocacy and reporting practices. And so we've been working with our legislative champion, Councilmember Shekar, to make sure we introduce a revision bill to get a data disaggregation law that reflects all of us and our community needs. And this is why we're here today. And we're really excited to share some of the context as to what this revision bill will entail. But before we do that, I'm going to go over the 2016 demographic data laws to kind of highlight as to why we are trying to introduce a revision bill. So the 2016 demographic data laws produces disaggregated data on ancestry, multiracial identity, and sexual orientation and gender identity. And we are specifically focusing on the ancestry part of this law, and we are not going to touch the sexual orientation and gender identity portion of this law. And that is something that we are in discussion for the future, but as of right now, we're focusing just on ancestry. And in ancestry, it provides disaggregated categories for the top 30 ancestry groups determined by the US Census Bureau. So basically, the Mayor's Office of Operations, who is focusing on the implementation status of this law, make sure that they use US Census Bureau data to make sure that they have a top 30 ancestry group on how it's going to be reflected on city forms. So it requires public reporting of the data collected via a voluntary demographic form by 7 agencies, and it's all going to be published on New York City Open Data. And specifically, this law touches on 2 components, and I'm going to go to the next slide and show that. It focuses on the voluntary form and the agency form. So there's 2 parts of the law. So the voluntary form is basically, for example, if I were to access city services from DYCD, I would have to sign their initial intake. And after the initial intake, they are asked, hey, do you want to fill out an additional voluntary form? And as a constituent, I could fill out that form, which would then be published on open data to make sure that we have transparency of who are the communities who are accessing city services from our communities. And the voluntary form consisted of demographic questions, such as the top 30 ancestry groups and all the disaggregated data categories that's required by the 2016 law. And there are also agency forms. So the Mayor's Office of Operations will annually review agency forms to identify those eligible for updating with the voluntary demographic form. So they make sure that all internal agency forms that is only city-based is making sure that it's reflected of the top 30 categories and other disaggregated categories to make sure it's in it. So those are the 2 parts of the law, which is required by the 2016 demographic data laws. And I'm going to pause to see if anyone has any questions. Okay, so I'm going to pass it to Lloyd, who's going to be talking about the implementation of the 2016 demographic data. So Oh, Ruth, so this is only voluntarily submitted information. Yeah, so the voluntary form is only voluntarily submitted information. So a little bit about the voluntary form itself. So over the implementation of this law began in 2018, as this law was passed in 2016. They have seen 300,000 submissions to the voluntary form, and I'm more than happy to Ruth talk about it after this virtual convening and share more information about that. And who No problem. And who needs to comply with the 2016 demographic data law? So these are the 7 agencies who need to comply with the law. So that includes ACS, DOHMH, DOE, DSS, DHS, DFTA, and DYCD. And these are the agencies that must comply with this law and make sure they produce disaggregated categories for the top 30 ancestry groups. And we're going to focus on the implementation part as to what we hope to see with this revision bill. And I'm passing to Lloyd.
Thanks, Dreamin. So as you all have heard, right, CACF has really been leading our efforts to make sure that, our city is doing as much as it can to really disaggregate for our communities in terms of ethnicity and race and ancestry. And so what's been going on in terms of implementation, right? Well, there's been a lot of challenges, right? So agencies are not effectively collecting the demographic information in our communities that the 2016 demographic data laws really demands of them. So we haven't really seen consistent implementation of even the survey that Jimin just mentioned with the voluntary demographic information from respondents, right? We haven't really, it's not consistent across agencies, right? So some agencies are using the survey a lot more and uploading that information on NYC open data where they're required to do, and others just aren't, right? And the disparities are actually quite huge. We don't have the information here because it's kind of unwieldy, but as Dreamin said, we're happy to share more about that later. In terms of the agency-specific forms, right, that's really where I want to focus the conversation with you all today. As Jimin said earlier, there's a number of agency-specific forms at DOE, right, and at DYCD, forms that they administer within their own agency. There's no federal, no state level administration. It's just an agency-specific form. And there are a number of those, right? And a lot of you also administer them to your clients. And agencies, there are a bunch of them that had to be updated at each agency, right? And many of them are still not yet updated over 8 years later. So that's a huge glaring piece of oversight that we really are fixated on. It's also very difficult to parse the agency-specific or form-specific data collected and published on NYC open data. So basically, the open data that we see out there, right, we don't know if that's data related to a specific agency form, right? And so that we can't really get into that here, but that's a big issue that we've also come up with. And then one thing that's also pretty concerning is that the Mayor's Office of Operations, as Jimin said earlier, is supposed to release this annual report updating the public, right, as to how things are going with implementation of these laws, which specific agency forms are eligible for updating and have been updated, right? Ops, when we were working on this, they actually hadn't released a report since 2022, right? And there are a bunch of late notices on the portal, the government publications portal that we've seen. I just checked just before this call, and they actually just uploaded the 2023 report last week. But it's only because we've been pushing with them, right? And we've really been pushing through the work with Councilmember Ressler as well as Councilmember Shekar Krishnan's team. So next slide. So a lot of challenges, right, that you're hearing us talk about. So in terms of the bill we're working on with Councilmember Shekar Krishnan, sorry, the focus of this, right, is on the kinds of race and ethnicity data collections at across all city agencies, right, independent of the voluntary demographic survey. So I really want to emphasize our focus is on, all agency race and ethnicity demographic data collections. And so our goal is to impact all city agencies, not just 7, like the 2016 law is focused on. And then our goal is also to establish a consistent data collection standard focused on race and ethnicity that goes beyond the top 30 ancestry groups by population, right? So one, ancestry, that term actually, it's kind of separate from what the federal and state guidelines are. So we really want to make sure that New York City's race and ethnicity data collection standards are actually about race and ethnicity. So they're actually technically aligned. And then second, right, we really need to have a consistent uniform standard across agencies and within agencies themselves. So for instance, right, DOH-MH, this is an agency that you would think, a big public health agency in the largest city in America, right? You would think that they would have some sort of standard, right, for data disaggregation by ethnicity across different divisions and units within DOH-MH. There's nothing, which is shocking, right? And that should shock you, and that should be very disappointing. It's very disappointing for us to hear that, right? So even though the spirit behind the 2016 demographic data laws was to really make sure these agencies could get on the same page, more or less, in terms of data collection related to, you know, as Jim said earlier, right, ancestry, multiracial identity, and sexual orientation, gender identity, that really hasn't happened, right? So we want to make sure that we get our bases covered on this for race and ethnicity. So we're advocating for more categories as well as more useful demographic data that our communities can use and that can actually help agencies in their work as well. Next slide. Thanks. So, you know, one of the biggest differences that our bill focuses on is on expanding the specific categories for inclusion in data collection and reporting. So in the 2016 demographic data laws, you can see in the left-hand side, these are the categories that are specifically focused on the Asian community and I guess Pacific Islander here. That fall under the top 30 ancestry groups, right? That's Asian, Indian, Bangladeshi, Chinese, Filipino, Korean, Pakistani, and then there's a consideration of other Asian Pacific Islander, right? And so that, you know, in and of itself, right, is so few. Like there are so many members represented on this call who serve different communities that fall beyond the scope of what's listed in those. I think it's like, you know, 6 explicit groups named. So in our bill, right, we wanted to make sure, one, that there were a lot more ethnic groups included, right? And second, that there was a requirement, that there be a requirement for agencies to not just collect at that very granular level, so collect at the Afghan, Kazakh, Korean, Bengali, Burmese level, but also re-aggregate that data at the Central Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, East Asian level, right? Because we've heard from you all and from different legislative offices, right, that having that aggregate subcategory data, right, like, you know, South Asians in my district, what are their needs, like how many, that kind of data is actually very useful to a lot of folks within our communities, for advocates and for legislators. And so to recap, right, some of the big takeaways for us, right, we want to be as inclusionary as possible. And so we are explicitly naming a lot of groups that you can see here. These number of these groups, the vast majority of them are actually the specific categories that fall under the federal guidelines in terms of how the federal government, in terms of the Census Bureau, does the race and ethnicity coding. What does that mean, right? So that means when they get a response that says Bhutanese, right, they know how to categorize that as opposed to Hmong and Malaysian and Chinese. And so they have their system. New York City should align with that. But in addition to that, we also make sure that there are groups that are present in our communities that are explicitly included. What do I mean by that, right? So you can see there's this other category that isn't called other. It's called Asian groups corresponding to other regions and transnational communities, right? And meaning Indo-Caribbean groups, right? Chinese Caribbean, Latin American, Asian, right? There are all these groups that don't necessarily fall into these bigger buckets that are more established, that we also need to make sure are explicitly included in our bill. And so those are some of the big changes. And then the third one, right, like I mentioned, we want to make sure that those re-aggregations, like the Central Asian, right, South Asian bucket, that is a data point that should be released to the public as well. So we're going to require that level of reporting in our bill. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, right, who's included? So our goal is representation for all. Yeah, Ruth, I see your question, right? So we're just showing you one part of the bill, right? We're just showing you how this impacts Asian communities, right? We obviously didn't write this bill just to focus on, the Asian and NHPI folks, right? We also have NHPI. There is like a MENA categories. There are also considerations for different Black communities, white communities, and so forth. So we really wanted to make this as comprehensive as possible. But that's a great question. But we're just showing you how it impacts Asian communities, given the focus of our coalition and our membership. And so it is truly representation for all. And then, as I mentioned earlier, right, we're updating the New York City Agency Race and Ethnicity Coding Standard to follow federal coding standards for write-in responses and subcategory aggregations, like I explained earlier. And then we're also adding changes to be as inclusionary beyond those federal standards, right? And so I sort of went through this, but another thing to add is, right, the federal level, they use Nepalese, but as we know, right, Nepali is preferred by our community members. Uyghur is, a group that we are explicitly including given the growth in this community, right, and this refugee community. Bengali and Punjabi are currently coded under Asian India, but we understand that this diasporic community that's not always the case, right? So we want to make sure that there's, a selection for Bengali and Punjabi that's separate of Asian Indian. And then again, including groups explicitly, right, that have for so long been rendered invisible, like Indo-Caribbean, Tibetan, and some others I mentioned. And I just want to clarify, right, our goal is not to have like this addendum or like this extra sheet of paper that has all these categories on it that then agencies are required to print, right? That's a lot of work, and we don't know how useful that is, right? Our goal is for agencies to adopt this standard internally, to basically be all on the same page in terms of how they're receiving and interpreting responses they receive from the public. And so, the goal is not to make the actual forms more onerous for agencies and for the public, right? We are very cognizant of how difficult it is to already get the clients that you all work with to provide such additional information about themselves, personal information, right? So we've really tried to be cognizant of that. So I'm gonna pass it over to Greg now.
Cool, thanks, Lloyd. Happy to share a little bit about the legislative process, just so you all get a sense at what goes on the back end, and how things will look as this bill moves forward. So, we're in this first, on the far left side of the page. Obviously, we already had this bill idea. Our office ended up being the first in time sponsor. And so we go to the legislative drafting unit here at the council, and they helped us draft a bill. We, working closely with Lloyd, G-Man, and Felicia, we were able to go back and forth with the legislative department and hear their concerns. And then we're finally pushing towards a bill that we feel comfortable and ready to introduce. And so then the bill is introduced, it receives a bill number, it may receive some co-sponsors either before it is introduced, which are called co-prime sponsors, or after it is introduced, which are regular co-sponsors. It also receives a committee assignment. So for instance, it could go to the Transportation Committee, the Parks Committee, etc. And the bill moves forward in the legislative process. At that point, it moves and is incumbent on the committee chair to hear the bill on a general oversight topic, or he can say, or he, she, they can say, okay, we want to hear this bill on, specifically. So the bill or slate of bills may be the oversight topic that a committee chair decides to have a hearing on. Bill is heard, the general public provides testimony, city agencies as well come forward and provide their thoughts and feedback on the bills. And then after that hearing is over, the bill is laid over in committee, and it is incumbent on, there are some internal council processes working with the speaker's office, the committee chairs as well, and the prime sponsor of the bill. They all work together to try and negotiate the bill with the administration so that the administration is on board with the bill language. And then once that happens on the back end and the speaker's office approves it, the bill then moves to the floor for a vote. First, it has to pass a committee vote, which usually happens the day of stated meetings. If you pay attention, you'll see a slate of meetings that happen every morning before the 1:30 stated meeting. And then the bill moves to the floor of the council for a vote during the stated meeting. And once the, simple majority the bill needs, and once it passes the council, there are three things that can happen. The mayor can sign the bill, the mayor can veto the bill, and the mayor can ignore the bill for 30 days. And after that, it becomes into law. That is different from, if you remember civics class, in the federal government, there's what's called a pocket veto from the president, where if he doesn't do anything, it's technically a veto and then it goes back to the legislature. Whereas at the city level, if the mayor doesn't do anything, the bill just goes into law. Now, the caveat I will say is if there's a veto, similar to what we see at the federal level, it goes back to the legislature and the council can override with a 2/3 vote. But let's say, council is either able to override or, the bill is signed or passes into law, then it moves to the implementation phase, as you see on the far right hand of the screen. And so agencies may have a rulemaking process to say, all right, now that we have this bill, here's how we're going to implement and execute this. And they come out with specific rules about how, the regulations will be written that the agencies will then follow. So that's just an overview of how a bill becomes a law here in New York City. Happy to answer any questions that folks may have either in the chat, or you can feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email if you want to have a more in-depth conversation about this process.
Just to add some context too, in addition, and thank you so much, Greg. That was so very, very helpful. And I hope folks feel the same way. And if folks want a more PDF copy of this process so you can share with your own respective teams, we're happy to send that over to you. Greg, when we introduce our revision bill, right, can you share with folks what process we're in? Because we don't necessarily have a committee just yet. So folks just know that.
Yes, so when you introduce the bill, we're hoping that will be next week. So the bill doesn't receive an assignment until it is introduced. So that's where we are right now. We're sort of finishing up the language of the bill and moving towards introduction. We submit it for introduction to the general counsel, and then it's almost always approved unless it's something completely abhorrent. And then that bill is approved and then it is introduced on the floor of council. There may be some hints as to where the bill would go, right? If you have a bill that's written and says, we want to expand the parkland in the city, obviously that's going to go to the Parks Committee. But some bills may touch multiple different agencies. And so, it takes some time for the legislative division to do some work to better understand where exactly the bill should go. And then once that decision is made, the committee assignment is reflected on the bill. So we don't have a sense of what exact committee our revision bill will go yet, but our strong hunch is that it will go in the Government Operations Committee, which is chaired by Councilmember Lincoln Ressler from Brooklyn.
Thank you so much, Greg. And we do have a question in the chat, and this will probably be more for Lloyd, but Greg, if you'd like to add to this, please do. And I'll just read Christine. Hi, Christine. So good to have you on. Your question out loud for folks. Can you tell us a little bit more about how we can be sure it will be implemented differently than in 2016, where agencies will potentially do things differently? Is there different oversight or some way forward for better coordination? So Lloyd, if you wanted to take this on first, you can.
Yeah, thanks so much, Christine. That's a great question. It's something that's top of mind for us. So what I didn't share is, we definitely have language in the bill so far that we think will be stronger. First off, right, this is specifying, this is a much wider reaching bill, and it's not just focused on 7 agencies, right? We do identify operations as the place where we want them to hold oversight authority. Although, that has been tricky because I think maybe in a previous administration, the team at operations was maybe easier to work with, and maybe this was a bigger priority to them back then, and that sort of shifted. I think we looked at the Massachusetts data equity bill, which is a state level bill, when we were drafting this, and we saw that there was an inclusion of a hearing in the specific bill language, and that's something that we hadn't seen so much of, and that gave us some ideas, right? So I think we have language that says that there's like a required like oversight hearing to update the public, right, on implementation of the eventual law. So that's something we want to bake in there. So those are some of the ideas we're working on. And Jimin, Greg, if I'm missing something, feel free to also jump in. That's a great question.
I'll just Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And I'll just say that oftentimes there's sort of this give and take, especially on the implementation side. And with the council and how we draft our legislation, we tend to be a bit more broad, because, being super prescriptive is often not liked by the agencies, and they'll kind of push back, and it can be tougher to pass a bill that is very specific and narrowly tailored to what exactly we want to do, rather than one that's a bit more broad. So there's a bit of this like dance that happens. And sometimes it requires us to pass a broader bill just to get an understanding, or, get our overall values reflected in legislation. And then relying on the agencies to come up with the specific, procedures and mandates for their agencies to follow. But sometimes after a period of time, maybe we say, all right, we passed the bill, we've had a window of time to observe, they're not doing it right, or maybe there's a gap missing. And then, we come back in as a legislature and say, all right, here, we want to do specifically this action, or we want ACS to take this action on data disaggregation and collection.
Yeah, thanks so much, Greg. And there's just one other point I wanted to add, which is that, we're not doing this in a vacuum, right? There is like the federal level implementation of the 2024 SPD 15, which is the new federal race and ethnicity standards. And part of those standards, those new standards, as Christine, right, requires, federal agencies to produce disaggregated ethnicity data for all the, minimum categories, meaning for Asian, for Black, for Middle East and North African, and so on. So we are doing that, focused on those implementation efforts. And then, but New York City should align with those as much as possible and as soon as possible, right? So we're trying to also leverage that to our efforts in New York City.
I did see a hand raised. I think it was Miriam that might have. There we go. It's in the chat. And for Ruth's question too, we don't have a bill number, but Miriam has, doesn't broad bill language give public agencies the opportunity to not adhere to the law? I think it says. I might have missed that. There we go. Yes, to the intentions of the bill. Greg, is that something you can inform? And I can repeat the question.
Yeah, would you mind?
Doesn't broad bill language give public agencies the opportunity to not adhere to the intentions of a bill?
Yeah, and that's one of the challenge with, that's why it's sort of a careful, needle that needs to be thread through legislation. Either having language that's broad enough that encompasses your vision, but also being specific enough so that, agencies follow the rules and do what we want to do, and the values behind the bill are reflected.
Felicia, Councilmember Krishnan.
And thank you. Yep, I see that, Jimin. Thank you so much. Appreciate you. I do have another question in the chat, but we'll answer that question after, because we have a really great, wonderful guest joining us today. It is Councilmember Shekar Krishnan. I'm gonna just, if I can find you and pin you, there you are. Wonderful. We'd be so happy to have you share some words with us. Thank you so much for championing this bill, this revision bill for us, and being just a champion of CACF and our coalition overall.
Sure. Thanks so much, Felicia. Thanks, Lloyd. And so good to see everyone on from all the organizations. It's such a honor to be here. And I was going between two events now all over Queens, but I wanted to jump on really quick too, because I'm very excited about us introducing our bill. We put a lot of work into it together with CACF, and just a huge shout out and thank you to them and to all the groups on who are going to be part of this coalition. And as you all know, and I don't need to tell you on this call too, but the way in which our communities are so often invisibilized when it comes to resources and services in our languages for us. We all know it well. You all know it from the advocacy side. I once upon a time knew it from the advocacy side, and now know it from the government side. And as the first Indian American council member, it was important to me to really make sure we push forward with our data disaggregation bill too. And I think part of it is just like it's a very practical thing, right? If we want the voices of our community to be heard, the most effective way we can do that is to make sure through data our needs are being addressed, right? Whether you think about during COVID, where data was not broken up for API communities, when you look at small businesses, when you look at the way immigrant services for our communities and languages, there's no real breakdown of our communities and the statistics to show how we as Asian Americans are impacted. It's no wonder that we are often invisibilized and just at most lumped together with everyone else too, with our unique concerns not really heard. That's something that's really important to not just me, but all of our API council members, and we make that point during budget negotiations, where we constantly raise the issues of how it's important that organizations like you all who are on the phone right now get the funding and support you need, because we know as Asian Americans how much work each and every one of you are doing for our communities, for our constituents. And so whether it's legislation, whether it's budget, resources itself, we always say in the city council, some of the best bills that we have are bills that really show through data the need for better and different kinds of policy. And that's why this revision bill is so important, because I think it will help us get there. It will make sure that we are seen and we are heard. And I know we've been for a long time working on it to get it to this point too. So please come out to our rally. Please, any way you could support, whether it's with social media, whether it's coming out, we'd love to see you all there, and then we'll push forward from there to get it done. But I know there are a lot of people in the city council who'll be very excited to work with us in this coalition to get it done. So thanks so much, CACF, and thanks to everyone on. I see KFSC on too, up and on too. So many awesome groups here. So Asaya, so I'm not gonna name them all because I get in trouble, but I'm already starting to. But it's because I'm so excited to see everyone. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. And council member, if we can just take one more photo
Sure.
with you, that would be so wonderful. So folks, if you are able to turn on your camera one more time as we take a group photo, and Lakshmi, let us know when you are ready. Ready to go? All right,
Yes, we're
1,
ready.
2, 3. Thank you so much, Councilmember. We
Awesome.
really appreciate you. Thank you for being our
Thanks so much.
champion.
Absolutely. Thank you all for the amazing work, and really excited to do this next week. So see you all soon.
Yes, and we'll share more details now as to what exactly we need you all to show up for
Yeah.
as advocates.
I jumped the gun.
No, we're so excited that you announced that. Thank you. We're honored.
Awesome. See you all soon.
See you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. That was so lovely. Appreciate everyone. And thank you, Greg, for taking us through this portion of just walking us through the steps on how to pass this bill. I want to go back to the questions we did have in the chat. There was one more that I might have missed. Again, Again, we don't have a bill number at this time, but as soon as we do, we will share it with you. And then, do we need other council members to sponsor the bill? Greg, you want to take this one?
Yes, absolutely. That is great, because one thing I didn't mention, if a bill receives a supermajority of council member co-sponsors, it will automatically receive a hearing. So that is 35 out of 51 members. If they sign on to the bill has to be heard in the committee that it is put in. So it's really important that as many council members as possible sign on to the bill. So that means you all represent organizations across our city, your local CMs, your neighboring CMs you have a relationship, etc. All of that, reaching out to them, letting them know about this bill, letting them know why it's important to you and your organization is vital, because if they get on the bill and we get a ton of support, not only can the bill receive a hearing, but that signals to council leadership and even the mayor that, hey, this is something that a lot of council members want, and they're going to pay more attention to it, and either, and ensure that the bill moves forward in the legislative process, especially here in the council.
Thank you so much, Greg. And we will, for folks here or who were unable to join us, please know that we do have a plan for how we'll attain co-sponsorship from city council members. So please look out for GMIN's advocacy there and leadership. All right. Thank you so much, Greg. And for folks who still have more questions, there is time to ask in the chat as we continue on in the PowerPoint. All right, I'm going to pass it back to GMIN.
All right, thank you, Felicia. So in order for our communities to get ready for this revision bill, we're going to talk about where it's headed and what are the next steps. So we will be having a speak out / presser next week on September 26th. It's going to be the introduction of our revision bill. And prior to the introduction, we'll be hosting a press conference in City Hall Park at 11 a.m. And currently it says in this slideshow that it's going to be tentatively, but it is official now. We will be there on City Hall Park at 11 a.m. and we're super excited. And it's going to be joined by a lot of our community members and also our community-based organizations, CACF members. So we ask you to join us at this presser to make sure that this intro of the bill is as successful as we can hope to be. And in the chat, I just shared a Google form. If your organization would like to join us for this presser, please just fill out the Google form and then we hope to see you there. So I'm going to pause if anyone has any questions about the presser specifically. Okay, feel free to ask any questions in the chat about the presser. Next slide, please. Sorry, folks, there seems to be a lag.
Sorry, folks, that there is a lag because I'm staring at the screen, at the slide, but you all can't see it yet.
All right,
Go
so
ahead.
there are other ways for you to be involved in this revision bill process and not only the introduction, but also the passage of this revision bill. You could feel free to join our I&M task force, which is composed of 18 API serving organizations who are all CACF members. If you join the task force, there will be an opportunity for us to fight for meaningful data disaggregation for API New Yorkers as a whole. And we focus on the advocacy. We make sure that our task force members are informed about the processes and making sure that we are doing the lobbying effort together to make sure that we have a revision bill that represents all communities. So feel free to email me or you could just feel free to DM me and I'll send you an email afterwards if you are interested in joining our task force. So that is the end of our virtual convening. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and you could just let us know if you have any questions from our webinar, or you could just feel free to put it in the chat. So I'm going to give folks a few seconds if they have any questions. Jessica, you asked, will you share language with us that we can use to reach out to council members to support the bill? The answer is yes. Once we have the language of the bill, we will definitely send it out. No problem.
Yeah, it's very important that our messaging for council members is the same or similar as possible. If you have a close relationship with a particular council member you'd like to see sponsor this bill, we'll share with you the parameters of the guidelines of the conversation and the language to use, as well as the bill number so that the council member has it so they can refer to it. But definitely something that we want to make sure we're all aligned in messaging about for sure. And thank you for being I'm going to just assume you're ready to go, Jessica, and you're ready to start lobbying some of our legislators, which is great. While folks are putting in questions, if you do have any, I just want to reemphasize why showing up to this press conference is so critical. CACF has been leading data disag for our API communities for more than 10 years. That means before we even had our 2016 law passed, We had been working and advocating with the council members during that time, as well as agencies, to talk about why it's so important that agencies and our city overall see our communities disaggregated, because that tells a different story about our needs. Now we're in a place where since 2016, after all these years, our city agencies are not in a place where they're effectively or confidently reporting data. And so that's a problem, because they've had so much time to implement this law that we worked more than 10 years previously in passing. And now we're seeing, okay, well, if there are issues with this particular law that are roadblocks or are unclear, our population within the API community has grown and expanded in so many ways, as well as other marginalized communities, that we need to update this law. Showing up to this presser demonstrates the urgency and the need for passing something like this. And that is critical. When we show up in mass, people across the city are going to be like, oh, this is something I should pay attention to. This is something that I need to show up. This is something I should be talking about within city agencies. So we're also going to have media coverage, which is very exciting. Thank you to Lakshmi and Jeeman, who have been working really hard to get media coverage for this presser. That's also going to help support us moving the bill, moving the needle, and having this pass in just the committee so it can get to the floor instated. Okay. So please, if you haven't had a chance to sign up, please come. And there is a speakers list if you are interested in speaking. And I would get in touch with Jeeman so that he can share a little bit more about what that speaker list is looking like and where there's room. We definitely want to have some council members who feel like they can support the bill and they're ready to co-prime it, attend and speak, as well as our community, of course. Just going to leave room for folks. If you don't have any questions and you just want to come off mute and just say something, maybe something that's really exciting that's happening, or something that you feel like you're looking forward to in regards to data to SAG, you're welcome to as well. All right, we're a little shy, but get ready to raise our voices and chant on September 26th. And be really excited, because we're so glad and grateful to have you all in community with us on the 26th and today. Thank you so much for showing up for our community. Thank you, Greg, and to Councilmember Krishnan and your entire office for being so reliable and huge allies in this process and champions. We're so grateful. And of course, thank you to Jeeman, to Lloyd for leading the charge here in regards to our Data to SAG team, Lakshmi, who's been working so hard in comms, and all of you. We really appreciate it. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.